we can record. We good to go, Hermano?
I think, would you like to check this, Commissioner?
That thing's red, so it looks like we're recording.
Oh, want to go over there?
No, Tom's got it here, so that's recording. Yeah. Yep, you are recording. Okay. There we go. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody.
Hello.
Good evening.
All right. Thank you for joining us on a cold, wintry Wisconsin night. My name is Rich Egg, and on behalf of Unite America, I want to welcome you to our monthly meeting here. You know, Unite America is a rather new organization. We're a group that's committed to bridging the partisan divide. We're actually nonpartisan ourselves, so we welcome everybody across the political spectrum, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent, or anything else in between. We welcome everyone. We're committed to trying to find a way to help our government become better than it is today. If you guys just take a walk down memory lane and think back to maybe an earlier period of time in our younger lives, would you say that things maybe back in the day were better than they are today? How many people think that? A better government many years back? Okay, yeah. I mean, the topic for tonight is on hyperpartisanship. And I think we live in a time that just exaggerates that to the extreme. And that's why I was so excited about Unite America, because I'll share my story here. For over 50 years of my life, I never was interested in politics. Actually, I'm an engineer by training. I work at GE Healthcare. Never had a political science class, never had any social science whatsoever. I mean, I was completely ignorant about what's happening. And so it wasn't until the 2016 election when I said, you know what, something's not right. I don't think that the person we elected represents the best of the American people, and I'm just not happy. It was like the first thought I ever had about politics. Then as I was pondering on that, I was like, I shouldn't complain, because Lena, my wife Lena leads the chapter with me. She's like, you're always whining about this. Why don't you go do something? And nothing like a wife speaking truth to power, more like power telling truth to the underling. So I remembered that my dad said, if you're not part of the solution, shut up or put up. So my dad's been gone 10 years now. I said, okay, I'm going to do something. So we did a little research on the internet. We somehow found Unite America, and I'll tell you why it attracted us in a minute. We said, oh, that's great. Okay, let's go to a meeting and find out who's here. We called up the national team and said, okay, where's the local chapter? I said, well, there is none.
There is.
Okay, well, who's the leader around here? Well, there is none. I'm like, would you like to be the leader? We didn't know any better. We're like, okay, sure. So that was back in April. We dipped our toe in the water. We officially launched in October, and here we are. But if you look at the card that you have in front of you, just a little background about Unite America. Let me tell you why I like this group. Unite America is part of a larger movement. So we call the larger movement the Nonpartisan Democracy Reform Movement. It's just a group of different organizations that care about our political process. We really officially don't take positions on policy, although I'm happy to talk about healthcare and education, environment, all those things with you. But I can't do that officially as Unite America. But we want to make the process work better. And the unique thing about Unite America, if you look on the upper right-hand side of your card, is this little picture of members of the Senate. And on the left, you have blue people, which are Democrats. On the right, you have red people, which are Republicans. But in the middle, you have a group of white people. Not white as in Caucasian, but white as in independents. And the unique thing about United America is they have this strategy called the Fulcrum strategy. The way the Fulcrum strategy works is on this premise. If we can elect like 4 or 5 independents or good quality people to the United States Senate, they can deny either of the major parties a majority. And when neither party has the majority, nobody has a firm hold on power. And when there's no firm hold on power, if you want to do something, you're by nature forced to work together. So that little group of 4 or 5 people can wield enormous power as a swing vote or as a fulcrum. So you might have seen one small example of it. You guys remember the Brett Kavanaugh hearings? Jeff Flake, he was on the committee. He kind of said, I will not recommend him going for it, will not vote for Brett Kavanaugh unless we take a little bit longer to investigate some of these allegations, because I think they're serious and they're worth investigating. And that, I thought, was a great example of the Fulcrum strategy, because would the Republican leadership want him to do that? He didn't. But he stood up and he said, no, we're going to do this. And because they knew they could not pass anything without him, they acquiesced, and thus we had a little bit longer to go investigate the claims. So that's the nature of the Fulcrum strategy, which is a signature aspect of Unite America. But if you look at the left here, it says our principles. These are the things we look for in independent candidates. We look for people who put country over party. You probably have seen in the news a lot, and Marty, our speaker, was at Madison. Just what the Republicans are doing right now is not really representing the best of democracy. Are you familiar with what's happening in Madison and the lame duck session and all the shenanigans going on there? That's not what we want, right? And I say this as someone who grew up as a conservative and a former Republican, not proud. We want to put what's best for, right? Or what's best for our country, what's best for our people before our party. So that's the first principle, is country over party. The second thing is we want to use common sense to find common ground to solve problems. There's so much yelling back and forth today, whether it be on social media or between people in the news, where we don't even spend time to listen to one another, to understand what our shared values are, to try to find a way to build common ground so that we can ultimately solve problems. I mean, that's why we elect our leaders, is to solve problems, not to yell at each other, but to govern. And to govern, you have to trade off. You have to find ways to work together, because if you don't accomplish things, you're defeating the whole purpose of being an elected representative. So we look for people who can find common sense, common ground, to solve common problems. Number 3, the timeless values of opportunity, equality, and fiscal and environmental stewardship. So opportunity, look, we believe all Americans should have a chance to advance and reach their full potential, right? Equality, it doesn't matter the color of our skin, the age, whatever you want to slice and dice attributes of how we're all born with. You know, those things shouldn't matter in terms of how we can advance here and how we treat one another. You know, fiscal and environmental stewardship, we have to be responsible. There's not an endless spigot of money. And similarly, the environment is the only earth we have. So we have to make sure that we take care and protect it. So all of these things would be something that we want our candidates to champion. And number 4, champion for competition, transparency, and accountability. Just one thing, have you guys ever heard the word duopoly? Kind of like monopoly, but duopoly is with 2 companies that control a market. And when you have 2 companies that control a market, you don't have much competition. They kind of rig the game just so that they stay in business rather than innovate, rather than find ways to reduce costs, rather than find ways to make their customers happier, because the game is all to themselves. That's exactly what we have with our 2-party system right now. And I want to be very clear that we have good people as Democrats and Republicans. It's really the system that by itself needs to be fixed. So I always want to make sure that we never attack people. That's not what we want. We look at the system, we take an honest look and say it has to be fixed. And that's why we want competition. We want more than 2 choices. Pretty much everything that you have that we can buy as consumers, we have more than 2 choices. At least usually 3. And that makes things better. And finally, the last thing is number 5, the shared responsibility of civic engagement. So I was very guilty for over 50 years of not really engaging civically. I don't think I can make up for that. If I look to my dad up in the sky, I'm not going to probably live another 50 years, but in the remaining time I have left, I want to make sure that I do my part to be part of this great country. You know, maybe we're not as great as we were, but we can be great again. Not that I'm, yeah, watch that. Be careful of that phrase. But, you know, I think we can be better. And I want to play an active part, and that's why I'm here with Unite America. You know, we're after 3 things on the right side of your card. What we want to do, number 1, is fight corruption. I was looking at an interesting stat the other day in terms of, there was a Gallup poll on the honesty and integrity as perceived by the general public of various professions in the United States. And does anybody want to take a guess as to what are the highest, most respected professions in terms of honesty and integrity that we Americans hold high? Any guesses? Firefighters, doctors, yes. Military.
Pastors.
So number one
Pastors.
was nurses. Nurses, 87% rated high or very high. So that's good. We trust our nurses. Number two was military officers. I think any military in here? Any former military? Okay, Pete, thank you for your service. But yes, we respect military officers because they're ready to give their life for our country. And number three, this will be a very interesting one for me.
Engineers.
I'm kind of in the middle of the pack here. Public school teachers. When I saw that, I had to smile. I'm like, I remember the name of every one of my K through 6 teachers. Every single one. I still remember to this day, more than 50 years later, because they made a difference. So we trust them. Now, guess what were the bottom three in terms of trust?
Politicians.
Attorneys. Okay, so attorneys were near the bottom. They weren't the bottom, though. Politicians, yes. So it's interesting. The lower you go in office, the more trust you have. So we tend to trust our local politicians than our state level politicians. But our members of Congress, their approval rating was 11% out of 100. That's it. The only two professions lower than them were used car salesmen and lobbyists.
Oh,
So of course,
former politicians.
yeah. So it's like all politicians. Lawyers were just slightly above members of Congress. So go figure. So I think that's interesting that we're in this situation, and we don't like that. We want to fight. They have those reputations because of just this. We have this inherent understanding of the corruption that happens. Right? We see what lobbyists do. They give enormous sums of money to our congressional leaders, and they usually expect some return on investment. Right? They're not going to do that just out of the goodness of their heart. And we Americans kind of inherently think, something's not quite right with that, right? You have a revolving door when they go back before get big high-paying jobs afterwards. So we don't like that. So part of what United America will do is we will try to fight corruption. Number two is we want to incentivize congressional collaboration. We think that, look, we've got to get back to working together. We've got to reach across the aisle. Democrats are not the enemies of Republicans. Republicans are not the enemies of Democrats. We are all Americans, right? And we got to get back to say we can solve problems together. And actually, Marty's going to go into that today because they have an excellent solution that we've adopted here. We fully support as United America, and we'll look at how we incentivize collaboration through the work of Marty and the labels. And finally, last one is what I shared before. We're going to execute the Fulcrum strategy. If we can do this broad set of three things, we think that in the next 5 election cycles or so, we can begin to see change. This is a long game. So if we had some of the younger folks here, I always have to, for the millennials, I have to remind them, this is not going to change next year. Okay, when I work with some of the younger generation at work, I have to remind them, they're not going to be CEO tomorrow, okay, or even next year. They have to go put get their experience in. Same here. It's going to take a while before we can convince people across the state to change their minds. Anybody know how many voters we have in Wisconsin? Take a guess. Broad. A million? Higher?
3.5?
3.5, yes, really close. That's the number that actually voted. We have 4.1 eligible voters, and about 3.5 of them turned out.
Yeah, that's great.
It's huge turnout for a midterm. So that's the number of people that we have to reach in our state, and we're just getting started. We've got a dozen people here in the room. We're going to keep doing these and figure out a way to grow this over the next 5 election cycles, see what we can do. But I'm convinced that we can change it if we persevere in both the good times and the bad. So that's the little background about Unite America. I want to thank you guys for coming. And now to turn to the main event is our speaker, our good friend Marty Finnegan. Some of you have met before. Marty leads the Wisconsin chapter for No Labels. The Labels is another nonpartisan democracy reform group. They've done a lot of excellent work that Marty will fill us in on. I share a special affinity with Marty. We've both lived in Chicago, we've lived here. We both have led large organizations, have done other nonprofit work. We come from Fortune 10 companies, and so we've seen the business world quite a bit, both over 30 years of experience. But Marty has lived in many foreign countries for longer than I've had. He's seen all sorts of different cultures. He's found a way to help them work together to achieve objectives. I think you're really in for a treat tonight to everybody has to share about his work with No Labels. So please join me in welcoming Marty Clayton.
Rich, I want to thank you for that lovely introduction. And I also want to thank you and Lena for the great work you've done in setting up this Wisconsin chapter of Unite America and in growing it. I have a lot of admiration for your creativity and your energy and your drive. Sometimes you're scary, but most of the time I admire it and I really appreciate it. And I think we're lucky to have Lena and Rich leading this chapter for us. I thought today I'd just spend a minute or two telling you a little bit about who I am and why I came to volunteer to work for No Labels, what No Labels is, what initiatives they've been involved in since they were created, and then I'll talk to you about a recent achievement that we can mark up and talk about next steps. So I'm a Chicago native, born and raised, for those who care, West Side Cubs. I used to see these guys in their apartment in Wrigleyville. I got my undergraduate at Northwestern, and then I moved to Washington, D.C., where I worked on a master's degree. I got it, actually, in international relations from Johns Hopkins. From there, I moved overseas, and I spent 28 years in international business in countries around the world. And then I shifted about 7 years ago or so, and I started managing projects overseas for nonprofits. I worked in Haiti for a couple of years, and then I worked in Nigeria. Last April, May, I wrapped up my last project, and I was thinking about next steps, which project, which NGO, which country. But I realized that all during this time when I'm just taking care of business, doing my job, raising my family, that I had this growing concern about the deterioration of our political climate, and in particular, about the inability or the unwillingness of our leaders in Washington to really get anything serious done. And so I thought about it and I realized that what I had been kind of a vague and building concern for me had reached a crisis point. And I have a certain flexibility in my life. I'm blessed that way. So I decided to shift activities again and do my small part in this democracy reform arena. And that's a big space, democracy reform. There are a lot of really important initiatives, and each one of them is backed by a really good organization. So you make a decision you want to do something, but what and with whom? So I decided to do some research, like you. I don't know what we did before the internet. I guess they had libraries. And the research I did, I want to give a plug. I came across this study, and if you haven't read it, it's a bit of a heavy lift, but it has an executive summary. You should read it. Catherine Gale is actually a Milwaukee person, a business leader, a political person, now a philanthropic and democracy reform leader. And Michael Porter, I've heard of him a lot because in my business career, I don't have an MBA, but every time I had a young MBA and I'd say, we need to look at that, he goes, oh, we'll use Michael Porter's 5 Forces. He's a very well-known Harvard Business School professor. And this study really resonated with me, and I won't try to summarize it, I won't do it justice, but the 2 things that really mattered for me. The first is I really believe that people respond to incentives. So if you want something to work well, get the incentives right. And then the converse of that is if you see something that's not working very well and you want to know why, a good place to start your diagnostic is to look at the incentives. So one of the points the study makes is that politicians today, they're not incentivized to do a good job at governing, or to take action, or to solve problems, or to serve their constituents. They're incentivized to create dissension and anger, to rile up the base, and thereby raise money. And think about it. Think about a member of Congress who maybe says, oh, we got some problems, I'm going to reach across the aisle and work with somebody from the other party and try to find a solution. What does that representative get? Primaried. or attack ads on TV from some PAC nobody ever heard of. And it won't be until after the election we find out who the money came from. Whereas the one who just plays the party line and holds firm to the position, no compromise, gets people angry, they win their elections. They win their primaries, they win their elections, they get campaign finance, and then they have long office. And if they get ever out of office, they join the revolving door. The other point it makes is that, to Rich's term about duopoly, you know, the Republicans and the Democratic Party form a duopoly. It's a private industry. And they operate by their own rules that they set themselves. Those rules aren't in the Constitution. They go way back, these parties, and really their main drive is to self-perpetuate and to raise more money. And in particular, they're supported by the term they use here is the political industrial complex, this army of for-profit individuals and companies, pundits, pollsters, campaign consultants, ad agencies, the media, partisan think tanks. There's a lot of money in politics, and you don't make more money by having kumbaya moments and finding solutions. If they solve all the problems, they won't need them anymore. So, the end of this paper talked about organizations that are trying to make a change, and they gave some examples, and that was a bit of a starting point. And so I started to look at these organizations, and I evaluated them. I'm not an engineer, but sometimes I'm accused of thinking like one. So I ranked them on 3 criteria. What's the impact of what they're trying to achieve? If this organization is successful, how much of a difference will it make? How hard is that going to be? How difficult or costly? And how long will it take? And based on those criteria, I picked No Labels specifically for this one initiative, which was called at the time Speaker Project, now Break the Gridlock, and I'll get back to it. But it will have a meaningful impact. It's like everything else, necessary but insufficient. It is very doable, and their time frame, this was back in May, June, I was researching it, was the November 2018, January 2019 time frame. So that's why I decided to volunteer for No Labels. I gave them some money. I signed up as an ambassador, and I began to communicate. I wrote little op-ed pieces. I set up a Facebook page. I joined the Privacy Death Star. I have a Twitter now. I went to some candidate forums. I actually got invited on a couple of radio shows. And then at a certain moment, kind of like your experience, they said, hey, how would you like to be the leader for Wisconsin? Well, okay. Just to try to expand it a little bit and see if we can get a little more something going in Wisconsin. So that's how I got to be where I am. And now I'd like to talk about No Labels and what it is. No Labels is a national citizens movement comprised of people who are fed up with the hyper-partisan stagnation that we see in government today, and who advocate for a bipartisan, consensus-driven approach to governing. And we advocate with fellow citizens, and we advocate with political leaders. It was founded in 2010 by Tom Davis, who was a former Republican congressman from Virginia, and by Nancy Jacobson, who's the CEO today, who was a fundraiser and a consultant who worked strictly for Democrats. The chairman is Joe Lieberman, a former senator from Connecticut, once a Democrat, got primaried out because he did the shameful thing of compromising being the senator, ran again as an independent and won because he was popular. The honorary co-chairs are Susan Collins from Maine and Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who just barely squeaked through, but he's still in as a senator, and he's our honorary chair, one of our honorary chairs. Who are these people who are part of No Labels? I've read articles in recent days denouncing us as centrists. And it made me think 2 things. The first is I'm not sure when centrist became an epithet, when it became a pejorative. But the other thing is, I don't know what a centrist is, and since I'm with an organization called No Labels, I don't even care to define it. I would say, though, that that's not what we really think you need to bring to be a part of No Labels or to embrace it. You should keep your ideological beliefs. We want to be a big tent. Conservatives, progressive, libertarians, whatever you are, whatever political party, no political party. Bring those beliefs. Don't check them at the door. Bring those beliefs to the table. And bring 2 other things at the same time. First, bring a conviction that people who have different viewpoints than you have something to offer and could also love their country and could also have the best interests of the country and its citizens at heart. And the second thing is, bring a willingness to engage and to do what No Labels calls the 3 C's. It's a little trite, but practice civility in your discourse. to try to find common ground, and then if you're a legislator, use that to co-sponsor legislation in the hope of getting some bipartisan solutions. A little more about who these people are. There's a study that was released probably a couple months ago called Hidden Tribes. It was a big survey of people, and I think they counted 7 tribes, and there's probably a total of 3 on kind of the extremes. They said these people, they are where they are, and the rest, they lumped them together, and you can take this or leave it, but I liked it. It resonated with me, and they called us the exhausted majority. And they described that as people who share a sense of fatigue with our polarized national conversation, a willingness to be flexible in their political viewpoints, and a lack of voice in the national conversation. The other definition of who these people are, No Labels commissioned a survey, nationwide survey with Harris back in September. And they found some things which won't be surprising, and it kind of resonates with what Rich said. 76% of likely voters think Congress is dysfunctional and gets very little done. 75% think members of Congress serve their leaders rather than their constituents. 82% think members of Congress should work across party lines more often. 86% think America won't find solutions to its biggest problems until Democrats and Republicans work together on compromises. How many people are in No Labels? Define member. Go on Facebook. There's 1.3 million followers. The other thing is, I said I'm an ambassador. That's a new concept that was created by No Labels in June. And from a base of 0 in June, we're now over 2,700 ambassadors, people all around the country trying to advocate like I do, with citizens and with political leaders for this mission. One other thing I should say about No Labels, which is about its legal structure. Normally you might not think this is important, but I'll speak to why it is in a little while. The big organization, NoLabels.org, is a 501c4. The IRS calls that a social welfare organization. So this is a nonprofit group that raises money to be spent on advocating for a cause. That's how I would define it. But that's really an umbrella, and within that umbrella, there's also a 501c3 nonprofit charitable, engages in education, but more important, they have a network of PACs. So let's be full disclosure. No Labels is affiliated with at least 6 political action committees. They raise money from donors, some small, some big, and they use that money to support their problem solvers, to oppose opponents of problem solvers, and to engage in political activities and political tactics. So I'll come back on that in a moment. So the initiatives of No Label. I did this research. I only joined in June, but from 2010, they've gone through 3 phases, and in my perception, they've actually been forced from one phase to another. They started in what I call a policy phase. They were pushed into a politics phase, which then led them into the process phase. Let me explain. If you go on No Labels website, you'll see a lot of policy papers. That's how they started their life. Each one of these is typically a little booklet. Each of them contains multiple proposals within it. For instance, Make Congress Work. There's a proposal, no budget, no pay. Everybody likes that. There was another proposal that said we should have bipartisan seating instead of Republicans and Democrats. You know, mix it up, boys. The other one that I found kind of interesting, this one, No Labels Policy Playbook. This was published in early 2016 as the presidential primaries were really getting underway. And it had 60 ideas, 60 policy proposals, and they did polling. And each of these had 60% popular support and more than 50% of Republicans, of Democrats, and independents. So it was kind of, like it says, a playbook. They organized a couple in this early phase, a couple of big meetings. One was a No Labels Problem Solvers Convention in 2015. And they formed this big, loose group of problem solvers. Presidential candidates were in there. Senators were in this group. Representatives were in this group. Governors, state leaders, former politicians, wannabe politicians. It was a big group, and pretty much all you had to do is say, oh, I like this idea. I want to be a problem solver, and you got a little seal of approval. Well, it didn't really work out. Really, they didn't get much traction. There were a lot of shops putting out policy papers, and a lot of these people who said, I want to be a problem solver, they didn't really. They wanted a little label. They got elected, and they didn't really produce. You want to know who probably the most famous one who got a problem solver? President Trump.
Ooh.
Now, and you can be for him or against him, but he doesn't fit in this mold in terms of bipartisan consensus government. Not yet, anyway. We'll see. It's too soon to tell. So,
Never give up hope, right?
yeah, that's it. So if you're not getting traction, you need to recognize the difference between activity and impact. So they're not getting impact. So that moved them into the politics phase. They said, fine. We had all these guys who said they wanted to be problem solvers, and men and women, and they didn't. And so we better get our own group of political leaders who we can count on to really walk the talk. So they got into the politics game, and they inspired the creation of the Problem Solvers Caucus. They're related, but one does not depend on the other. Problem Solvers Caucus is an official House caucus. Just before the election, it was 24 Republicans and 24 Democrats. They don't report to No Labels. They report to themselves. They're elected leaders. They report to their constituents. But they got on board with No Labels, and they're heavily involved, and there's a lot of communication. And No Labels supports these because the 24 Republicans are renounced as rhinos, and the 24 Democrats are renounced as dinos. So No Labels, via these PACs, supports these people, and they oppose their opponents. And once in a while, either they do or they consider opposing opponents of compromise and bipartisan problem solving. So in the most recent cycle, 2018, No Labels contributed $7 million to 17 Republican candidates, and they contributed $8 million to 17 Democratic candidates. This caucus got up to 48. A couple members went to the Senate, a couple members ran for other office, a couple members retired, a couple members got defeated. So we'll see how it shapes up post-election. But they make some commitments when they come in, and they're brought in on the Noah's Ark system, one Democrat, one Republican at a time, always two. And among other things, they commit to 51, 51, 75. If 51% of Republicans in the caucus, 51% of Democrats, and 75% of the overall caucus support something, you've got to be on board. Even if that's going to cause you political problems, either with your party leadership or with your constituents. So it's a serious deal, unlike that earlier problem solvers group that was formed. So they formed the caucus, and they began to work on legislation. And I've got a few handouts over there. I didn't make a ton of them. And it's good because we're not a ton of people, but a couple of the summaries of their initiatives are over there on the table. But they worked together and found, they said, we got to yes. We got to yes on a bipartisan solution for healthcare, a bipartisan solution for immigration and border security, a bipartisan solution for gun safety, a bipartisan solution for infrastructure. All these great ideas, nothing got to the vote on the floor. Nothing even got to committee. They were completely shut down. And this leads to the process phase. So the Problem Solvers Caucus, some of them are veterans, so they knew how things work. Other ones were more new. And No Labels realized Congress has been hijacked. Congress has been hijacked by the leadership of the parties. And it was true in the Ryan speakership. It was true in the Boehner speakership. It was true in the Pelosi speakership. It goes at least all the way back to Denny Hastert and his famous Hastert Rule, and probably before that, as far as I know. So to change the abysmal performance of the House, you need to change the way the House operates. And the way the House operates is largely determined by the House rules. The House rules, they're not the Constitution, they're not a law, they're what the winning party sets every 2 years. And they just did it. The winning party comes together somewhere around Thanksgiving, just before or just after. They say, under what rules will we operate, and who will be our candidate for Speaker? So the determination was, now we got to get into the process of how this works. And that's the process phase, to break the gridlock French. So this says, in June, No Labels called it the Speaker Project. And there's a document, which this is old news, so I didn't reproduce it, but said, here are some changes to the rules that we need in order to make the House function better and encourage bipartisan cooperation and get some things done. Within a month, the Problem Solvers Caucus released its own set, which was not identical, but in the same vein, with the same objectives. And they actually enshrined this in a law. It's House Resolution 1090. They introduced it as a bill before Congress. I thought about, I could go through the 10 changes they proposed and then later compare it to what we got. I think that would be more than you need to know or probably want to know at this point. If you want me to follow up, I'd be glad to do that. But I will say what we're looking for with this Break the Gridlock package is, one, to no longer allow initiatives started by individual members to die. Congress is where good ideas go to die. It shouldn't be like that. And so to foster the passage of member initiatives which address constituents' priority was one. The second was to increase or improve transparency and accountability. Congress, as I've learned, is a really opaque place. These things die, and you don't really know who killed it or how or by what arcane twisting of the rules or so forth. So they wanted to change that. And the third is, with these rules changes, they wanted to foster and even reward consensus-driven bipartisan government and legislation. So that was the point of this, and they introduced the package, Break the Gridlock, and I will say one other important thing. 48 members in the caucus. If you look at the bill, it had 30 co-sponsors from both parties. Of them, 20 took a step further and signed the Break the Gridlock pledge, which said, not only do I support this, I will only vote for a Speaker of the House who also supports these rules changes and is willing to put them through. And it was about equal, well, it ended up being 9 Democrats anyway. It was very roughly half-half Republican Democrat who took that pledge. So what happens? The ambassadors got to work, No Labels got to work, the Problem Solvers Caucus got to work, No Labels helped them resist the attacks they were getting from Democrats from the left, Republicans from the right. And as you all know, the Democrats took the majority in the House and took 40 seats, maybe 41, if California ever finishes counting. I don't know if that's happened yet. And these are just a couple of headlines, but to her credit, presumptive Speaker Nancy Pelosi, with her presumptive head of the Rules Committee, Jim McGovern, said, we're going to change the way the House operates. Here's a couple changes to the rules. And by the way, there's a video out there somewhere. Almost every single speaker in history, when they first come in, they say, we're going back to regular order. We're going to have open process. We're going to reach across the aisle. And it lasts anywhere between 30 and 90 days. But Nancy Pelosi said, no, we're going to change these rules, which was a good step. The Problem Solvers Caucus looked at what she proposed, and they realized that it didn't go far enough. So they engaged her, I believe, behind the scenes first. Didn't really work. And so then it became kind of public. And these were then the 9 Democrats who are holding Nancy Pelosi hostage to gum up the works and prevent her from getting anything done now that we've won a majority. Why do we need bipartisanship? They came under a lot of heat, these Problem Solver guys. No Labels too, but No Labels is just an organization. These are politicians, and they're getting hammered on social media. They're getting phone calls. Their party leadership is after them and so forth. So, but they held their ground. I give them a lot of credit for it. It took real leadership and real courage. They said, we're not opposed to Nancy Pelosi, but back in June, we said, we're only going to vote for a Speaker who supports these changes. So they had a few more rounds of negotiations, and they arrived at a really good solution. And this is not a victory for the Problem Solvers Caucus or No Labels. It's not a victory for Nancy Pelosi. If anything, it's a victory for the country. And they just came to a good arrangement. And I will tell you about a few of these changes that are now being made in the rules and what they do. The first is every member gets a voice. If there's a bill with 290 co-sponsors, that's 2/3 of the House, which means there are bipartisan co-sponsors, it gets heard. The detail is that the Problem Solvers Caucus wanted that to go automatically to a vote. This now gets on what's called a consensus calendar. So there's a consensus calendar, and bills like that get put on the calendar, and it's looked at periodically, hopefully frequently, so they don't just go away and die. It's kind of a public place for them where people like us can keep an eye on them and see what happens. There's a more inclusive amendment process, especially in the latest House. There's a lot of use of what's called closed rules. Bills come to the floor. Don't worry about whether you like it or not, whether you want to change it, whether you can improve it with an amendment. These are closed rules, no amendments allowed, up or down vote. So they made changes which first will make that less likely to happen, more openness to amendments, and in particular they give favor to amendments that have bipartisan sponsors. This is one I wasn't even expecting, and the Problem Solvers Caucus didn't ask for it. Modernize the discharge position. The discharge petition, they just tried to use it a couple months ago. A group of moderate Republicans, apparently there are some, the Problem Solvers Caucus, and moderate Democrats, there are some, maybe the Problem Solvers Caucus. They tried to get a bill on immigration that could get 218 signatures. And they got close, and then Speaker Ryan said, no, we can do something else. And in the end, it didn't work. But I thought it was interesting that that discharge petition existed. Well, it turns out, now that I read it, that only works if it's on the first Monday of the month when Congress is in session and the moon is aligned with Venus. So they've kind of simplified that. It's going to be easier to use the discharge petition. Increased committee transparency. Members now are supposed to get 3 days notice when a bill will be considered. They have to get the bill too at the same time. So you get the bill and you have 3 days to consider it. That, by the way, has been a promise for a long time. It's actually been a rule that just gets waived. There'll still be the possibility of a waiver. I'll come back on that. Reform the motion to vacate. The motion to vacate exists since forever. It allows one individual member so far to make a movement to kick the speaker out of his or her job. And that allows a very small faction of the House, most recently it's been the Freedom Caucus, to hold the speaker hostage and prevent him or her from really representing the whole House and therefore the whole country. That's why Boehner was pushed out. Paul Ryan, when he was talked into accepting the speakership, tried to get that modified as a condition. He was not successful. My personal view may be that thing hanging over his head may be one of the factors behind what, in my view, he's my representative, by the way, ended up being a pretty ineffective speakership, unfortunately. And the final thing is they didn't go as far as the Problem Solvers Caucus wanted, but they're going to ensure that there's a better correlation between the party ratio on committees and the party ratio in the House. Again, they didn't go as far, but it's a good step. So this is really positive, and it provoked a lot of denunciations, including from Representative Mark Buchanan of Madison. He came out and it was very aggressive, and he said, I was duped. I was in this movement and I was duped. I read that, I read all of them. I'm concerned, I'm an ambassador, I'm with this organization. And I find two things in these denunciations, and one of them is a good faith disagreement or concern or discomfort with the model I described, which is we're using legal campaign tactics to play politics and to get what we want. And a lot of people don't like that, and I understand why. They don't like it when candidates do it, and they don't like it when organizations do it. I personally don't agree with that, but I can respect that point of view. But a lot of the other denunciations really were founded on falsehoods or just denunciations. And what I think is happening, at our last meeting, our friend George Penn from United to Amend was talking about the great work he's doing in campaign finance reform. And he used a quote, which is misattributed to Gandhi, but it doesn't matter who said it. Now I'm going to say it. First, they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. So these denunciations, I think, for me, is actually a good sign. It means that No Labels and the Problem Solvers Caucus have left the ignore and laughter stage. And now, remember I talked about that duopoly and the really powerful entrenched forces behind the status quo. They don't like what's going on. This is a threat, and they're reacting as you would expect them to. So, what are the next steps for No Labels? Well, the first thing is this rules changes. It's necessary, but insufficient. This enables, but it doesn't guarantee anything. It enables bipartisan compromise. It doesn't guarantee anything. So the first thing we need is the House to walk the talk. Nancy Pelosi, in my humble opinion, which I respect, is probably one of the most talented, energetic, experienced, savvy legislators that the House has ever seen. If she wants to make bipartisan change happen in Washington, it probably is going to happen. But if she doesn't, it's not. The fact that she made these public commitments to these changes is good. But if she doesn't want to do it, she'll figure out a way to slow walk it, and we'll try to watch her. But that's the first thing. And then if she walks the talk, now we need some Republicans to step up, because it takes two parties that do bipartisan. And then if we get it to the House, we need the Senate to go on board. Now, the only thing I've heard recently is that it's one thing when you have kind of a do-nothing House and the Senate doesn't get anything. I didn't hear anything. Nothing really important coming in. But if a bipartisan bill comes with 290 sponsors from the House, you know, even the Senate, and Mitch McConnell's got to say, well, maybe we need to look at this, you know, and so hopefully we get some change there. Then it has to be signed by the president, and then don't forget the fourth step, it has to not be overturned by the courts. So that's one of the first next steps, is to watch this, monitor, intervene where we need to, and in particular, protect those problem solvers. And we hope there'll be new ones. We need to let them know that we've got their backs. The second next step is to do the same thing in the Senate as we did in the House. So we've already got a start. I told you about Lieberman and Collins and Manchin. The Problem Solvers Caucus has been meeting with these and several other senators periodically. And No Labels is going to try to encourage them to get a similar, not sure if it would be called a caucus, maybe it would be in the Senate. And that would be very useful. And the final next step I'll talk about from No Labels, it's pretty exciting. It was just launched about 10 days ago in New Hampshire. No Labels has a state organization in New Hampshire, and it's bigger than mine. Let's just leave it at that. They have meetings. 250 people show up. But they're actually, now they sent national people there, and they've opened an office. Here's the idea. So you all know that New Hampshire is the first primary, one of the first, and that they practice retail politics there. People really get in, and candidates come to your house. Hey, how are you? Yeah, can I have your vote? So that's why they chose New Hampshire. And the idea is, between now and November 2019, organize New Hampshire citizens to get behind what we call the unity commitments, which is to say, any presidential candidate, you want my vote, you want to come to my house, you want to talk to our town hall, you want to go to a debate and have questions, here's the questions we have for you. Will you commit to forming a bipartisan cabinet? Yes or no? Will you commit to engaging in question time for the president? You've seen that on TV in the British Parliament? Yeah, Q&A with the president and Congress. Will you commit to having regular, systematic, periodic meetings with congressional leadership? And finally, because this is one of the most hot-button divisive issues in the country today, will you commit to introducing a comprehensive immigration reform proposal to Congress within 90 days of being elected? And all this is to lead to a national unity convention in New Hampshire in November 2019. And the hope is, as all these candidates start to decamp there and they're going around doing their retail politics at cafe, they hear these questions again and again and again and again. Whether Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, whatever it is, when you're on TV at debates, it's always these same questions. It starts to sink in, and we actually get some of these things. And we get some of these candidates that try to move towards the center. And maybe candidates who say, no, I don't believe in that, they get put to the side. So those are the next steps for No Labels. I'd just like to close and talk about next steps for democracy reform. I said earlier what a big space it is and how many important initiatives there are. What do we need next? Do we need electoral reform, ranked choice voting, open top 4 primaries, multi-member districts? Do we need an end to gerrymandering? Do we need to get after campaign finance reform? Do we need to just go after corruption? Do we need to break the duopoly and get independence in there? So many movements, so many good causes, and so few people with the energy and the time to devote to that. So the first thing I would say is thank you for coming tonight, because you're making the time. And I applaud you for that, and I encourage you to continue. And then the second thing is, as you're choosing which cause or which organization, have a really serious look at United America and what Lena and Rich have set up, because I sure am. Because they're setting it up as really, you can see it on the card, kind of an umbrella approach. And this should allow them to take what resources we're able to gather and to allocate them or to direct them in a strategic way and to kind of plot out the paths that make the most sense and to attack obstacles which are on the critical path of multiple initiatives and so forth. So I think it's a great organization. I close just by thanking you again for what you're doing. I know I've got 3 tasks on my list that I'm behind on, but I'm going to do them. I'm working for you guys because I believe in what you're doing and I believe in the cause. So that's my pitch for tonight, and I'd love it if we could have just a discussion on any of these topics or any other ones as well. All right? Thanks very much.
All right, thanks, Marty. Yeah, let's open it up for questions for Marty. Boyd, I'll be up here too, but primarily for Marty. Any questions about No Labels and what issues that they might be facing, how we can help? All of those are on the table right now. Similarly for United America, if you have questions about that. Otherwise, I also could have some questions for you guys. Lucia.
So Marty, I wonder if any of the work that's going on now is applied to our state specifically. We've talked about sort of the national issues, which
Right.
I totally agree with, but is there any interest in trying to apply that approach to Wisconsin?
we ambassadors engage with No Labels, they have conference calls and so forth, and this question gets asked all the time because most states have similar problems, and No Labels' response is, we know, but it's all we can do to tackle the national level. So that would really be kind of up to us, to get after that kind of thing in Wisconsin. And I'll tell you frankly, for me, No Labels, when they asked me to be state leader, I said, have you got any members? Well, I think we have a list, and they had a list of 87 people. And I think the list was formed in 2010, and that's a long time ago. So that list is pretty much dead. And I've been able to build up, some great collaborators who worked actively to lobby, not to lobby, that's a bad word, but to advocate with political candidates and leaders in the most recent race, including Lena and Rich, who contacted Sensenbrenner's office and actually got Tom Pazurek to sign the Break the Gridlock Pledge. So for me, we should get in an umbrella organization and put that issue of how could we get more bipartisanship in the Wisconsin state legislature on the strategic pathway, and then kind of evaluate how do we get there and where does it fit on the critical path. Because I think it's a huge deal. I agree with you.
Well, that makes more just to go with what they say in presidential campaigns, when there is an independent candidate that runs, they always say, like the Green Party, you should always start running, which I think is bogus, but anyway, start running down in the local elections and win there first, right? So it's a similar concept. I don't agree with that. I think that if you want to run for president and you have the ability to do so, and you qualify, by all means, run for president, because you may have great ideas. You may not get any backing from anybody, but in our current system, the way that it works.
Right.
But what's the difference there?
Well, I think there could be two reasons you would want to work at the state level. The one may be if you believe that that's the pathway to national. But a lot of the problems we have need to be solved at the state level.
Correct.
A lot of education at state level. Gun safety. Let's not call it gun control. Let's call it gun safety. If you think there's anything done there, probably it's a national, state level issue, and there are a lot of gerrymandering is a state level issue. So I think there's a lot of. I will say one thing though. So I went to Madison last week, and I had the appointment scheduled to see the staff of Mark Pocan to talk about Break the Gridlock and the problems I was causing. I lined up with a constituent who would read to help me there. And it so happened that on that same day, all the protesters were in the Capitol, and on that same day, Mark Pocan was publishing his denunciation of No Labels in the Huffington Post. Anyway, it was a fun day. But since I was there, I went to see my senator, my representative, and I didn't go with a hoodie or I dressed in a suit. I wore a red tie, and I got in. And the Senator Van Wangart was on the floor. I spoke to his staff, and they were polite, and they took the note. I went to my representative's office, Samantha Kirkman, the longest-serving representative in the assembly. And she wasn't there. I was talking to her staffer, and she walked in. She goes, "Oh, Marty, come on in." So we had this talk. Well, she was holding her ground, and I won't go into all the details about why this makes sense and why they already proposed this and Walker vetoed it and so forth. But I did have to think when I thought about it. She goes, "You know what you're walking on at the national level, it's not as bad in Wisconsin." And I'm thinking, well, because what do we have in Wisconsin? Do we have stagnation and nothing getting done? Or do we have a lot of things getting done that maybe we don't like, or some of us don't like? But, and then is the deficit out of control, or do we just pass bills, spending bills any which way? So I'm not sure, I think we could all agree that Wisconsin is better off than Illinois.
Okay, we agree here.
Okay, let's just leave it there.
If I could build on that, Lucia, so like Marty said, we're a big tent with Unite America, and we just want people to get involved with any of the nonpartisan orgs. Right? Like he's on our strategy team with John. We would go with Marty and try to advocate on the No Labels piece, because we all care about these things. I think the power that we have to get is there's all these little groups in Wisconsin that we have to pull together. And we had a first call with about 10 of the leaders of the different orgs in the state to say, okay, we gotta connect and figure out how we do this together. It doesn't make sense for our little group of 25 or our little group of 200 to do these? How do we get to a group of 2,000 or 20,000 eventually to do this? And the topics are fairly common, right? You get ranked choice voting, open primaries, gerrymandering, campaign finance reform, some type of voter enfranchisement. All those things can work together. What we are kind of converging on is, Marty's push with break the gridlock was very urgent. So we all kind of said, let's go help get that done, because January 3rd, I think, is when they're gonna vote.
That's right.
So we gotta do that, and so we talked to Tom Palzowitz, tried to see Sensenbrenner and so on. But from a strategic perspective, I think ranked choice voting, at least as we socialize it with the other leaders of the different orgs, seems to be the next initiative that we have to kind of really rally around and say, okay, all the orgs, even if you're a gerrymandering org, we're gonna help support trying to get this passed, right? And so our strategy team is gonna be looking at, okay, what, out of our 132 legislators, which ones are, supportive of it, which ones would sponsor it, and how does that stack up? And that's how we're gonna start lining it up. The thinking about ranked choice voting is we wouldn't necessarily do it for the state folks right now, but make a state law so that our congressional leaders would get elected with ranked choice voting. So that's kind of what we talked about in the last call. It's not solidified yet, but that would be one probably big thing that we're trying to get all the democracy reform movement people aligned on.
Does that make sense to you, that ranked choice voting would sort of be next in terms of prioritization, or would you have thought something different maybe?
I think just based on what has happened in the past few elections, that certainly would, there's all blame about who did this and who did that, and whatever. But I think that with ranked choice voting, different outcomes have certainly would have happened from elections nationally in the last 20 years. And I think that would have probably been a good thing, because I think with ranked choice voting, you actually see that more people have an opinion that is common. So you may not think that Joe Blow is the best candidate, but you think he's the second best candidate. And that also gets more people to have a voice too in terms of running as well. And that's what's really more important. And there shouldn't only be two
choices.
Two choices, right. So I don't know if you're familiar with this quote, and maybe it wasn't. I've heard Ralph Nader say it because I've worked on his campaign a couple of times, and he said the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is how quickly they get to their knees, essentially for the lobbyists, for the there's no, he's like, we live in and that's what he preaches a lot, is we live in a duopoly. There's a duopoly of government. Right. There really is we don't have a choice. The choice is the least worst.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
a terrible choice.
And that, when running independent candidates, that's the single biggest question we run into all the time is, this is going to be a wasted vote, or you're just spoiling it for Evers or spoiling it for Walker. It's funny how it's always the other side that you're spoiling it, no matter what. So we'll be, kind of advocating for that. We're going to test a phrase, more choice, more voice. That seems to resonate in New Hampshire and Maine. Maine was the first state to pass statewide ranked choice voting. But every state is different. So we're going to, even within the state, right? Northern Wisconsin, Western Wisconsin, very different than here, very different than Madison. So we've got to really branch out and, fine tune what resonates with each group of people and make sure we represent them. Right, great question. Other questions?
That's all we have to do, right?
Like I said, this is going to be like 5 election cycles just to get things rolling.
Yeah.
So, Marty, you described a situation where the speaker agrees to a change of rules, and you say that will last for 30 or 60 or 90 days, and then it's back to business as usual.
Yeah.
So, what's the recourse, and how do you avoid taking basically one step forward and then 2 steps backwards to get to the end point?
I think it's the critical issue we face. We have to watch, and we have to be prepared to intervene again and apply pressure. I think there's a few hopeful points, though. And one of the really hopeful points is it's obvious that people are fed up, because not only did the House change parties, there are 46 newcomers. And those 46 Democratic newcomers signed a letter the other day, and I'm gonna paraphrase it, and I may not do it justice, but they sort of said, look, we know we need to do oversight, good. But let's not go overboard on investigations and condemnations. Let's get some stuff done. And those are newcomers, so none of them were in the Problem Solvers Caucus. So for me, that's a big deal. And if we can, and now that the Republicans are in the minority, they should be really favorable towards bipartisan compromise, right? So I think there's more hope than I would have had in prior sessions. And also, it's not trivial that she made a public commitment to change these rules. And that, I wouldn't say she did it under pressure, but it was an outcome rather than just something she cooked up on her own. But it's far from a done deal, unfortunately.
Well, and also you talk about Mark Pocan, who gets on board, and then when the going gets rough, gets off board. And
Well, when I asked his staffer about that, and I don't think the guy, I don't think he knew Mark was gonna publish this thing. I said, well, do you know why he was out? And he goes, I think he wasn't comfortable with you guys getting involved in electoral politics. He liked it when you were a policy shop. Now you're PACs, he wasn't comfortable with that. So that part, I can say, well, okay, let's respectfully disagree. But whether or not that's the reason, or is because he's part of the duopoly and feels under attack, I don't know. He hasn't called me back.
I'm sure Scott Fitzgerald and Robin Voss will call you back.
Yeah.
Hey, Marty, question for you. So it's exciting to see No Labels expanding into the Senate now, with Susan Collins and Joe Manchin as the honorary co-chairs. Is there like a number that No Labels is looking for that would be the critical mass in the Senate? Is that they want 10, the equivalent Problem Solvers Caucus there, 20? Any thoughts on that?
I haven't heard him talk about that. But when I hear him talk about the Senate, I just think about the Fulcrum strategy, which Unite America, when I was researching, was actually called the Centrist Project, right?
It was.
But that was all about the Fulcrum strategy, and that's why you pick a house, a chamber, which has fewer members, so that it takes fewer elections in order to have that kind of leverage. Similar thing we might think about in Wisconsin. You guys have been saying, 99 representatives or 33 senators. Let's see if we can get, and the senators already more closely balanced. I will, No Labels. It's a funny organization in that there's somewhere between 10 and 15 people who work full time for No Labels, including a bunch of puppies, little interns. Just got their poli-sci degree from George Washington or something. Great, energetic, bright, enthusiastic people. And then there's Nancy Jacobs, and she's a player, right? And then there's these people who aren't working full time, but they're there. Joe Lieberman's there. He was on a call the other day. I was on a call with Joe Lieberman. And the donors. The donors are, I don't know all the donors. And you can eventually find the PACs, and you can find some of the donors. But I've come across these articles in the Milwaukee Business Journal. David Lubar. I said, oh, who's David Lubar? Lubar School of Business at UW.
All kinds of stuff.
Yeah, Lubar, there's Lubar, that. Bud Selig. So there's all these guys out there. So No Labels is interesting. So I'm not sure if they're sitting there saying, do we need 7 or 9 in the Senate, But they need to sooner or later. But they put a lot of thought into this unity campaign. And they're staffing it, and they seem to really thought it through. There's a guy, one of the people working for him is not a young enthusiastic pup. He's an experienced, and his name's Ryan Clancy. He's the director of strategy. I don't know him, but I've heard him speak, and I've seen things he writes. He's bright. Another woman, Margaret White, is also pretty compelling and impressive.
That would be interesting. I mean, it would only take about 4 or 5 in the Senate. So if we get 4
That's
or 6,
right, isn't it? Yeah.
And those folks are willing to go counter to their party leadership, that could also.
And it may end up being a lifeline.
Mhm.
I mean, Susan Collins, people are mad at her.
And
I'm not sure if her election is 2020 or 2022.
I think 2020.
Yeah, so she's on the short list. So, and Manchin just made it through, but he's got 6 years. Flake is gone. Corker's gone. I don't know.
Ryan's got, it'll be interesting in 2020. So, other questions for Marty, for us? I have some for you guys.
Wait, if I could ask another one.
Sure.
Sure.
It seems that, when George spoke at one of your meetings about, the desire to reverse the language, I guess, of the, United,
Citizens
Citizens
United, yes.
United. But the no labels in United America are skirting around that issue. There is so much money in politics. Is that just such a long game that some of us may be dead by the time it's done, so we need to worry about other strategies that are shorter term?
So I think we have to play in all time horizons. So short term, like break the grid line, very short term, got to do that by January 3rd. We have this midterm time horizon, which is in the next 10 years, the next 5
Mhm.
election cycles, what we're playing with. Citizens United will take a while. I mean, George shared that he might not even be around by the time it finally passes, because we need 38 states to do this. We're at 19 right now. So to pass the 28th Amendment, it will be big. We support that. We're not skirting around it, but just by the rules of a 501c4, you're not required to disclose. I'll say for United America at the national level, we voluntarily disclose our donors above $200 for 501c4.
Okay.
So we're not skirting around it. I think No Labels is also saying we're going to use big money, but we're going to do it to achieve these objectives. So we're not lying about not using big money. I don't know if they disclose it.
Well, no, I mean, they don't. People ask them to, and they say 401c3s typically don't, and we're not going to. You'd have to dig. But to your point, Lucia, when Rich says we really need to get after ranked choice voting, that's kind of why I asked. In the back of my head, I said, really? As opposed to campaign finance reform? And maybe you won't get the constitutional amendment which says money is not speech and corporations are not people for a while. But you might be able to get legislation which says transparency. You have to disclose, or you could chip away at it. There probably are other strategies. I haven't done enough research. And I almost think that, money is the root cause. And then if we don't go after the root cause, we may not get there. So, but I could be persuaded on ranked choice voting. The thing with ranked choice voting is it has a lot of momentum, and you could see it
And
happen.
that's good.
Yeah, but the other thing, No Labels, what's interesting about No Labels, so Unite America is a democracy reform organization, and so is United to Amend and so forth. No Labels wanted to be a policy organization, and ended up being a process policy reform because you couldn't get anything done. But my impression, based on what I hear and what I've read, is they choose issues where they think that the parties can get to yes. So why don't they go after campaign finance reform? It could be because they benefit from the rules. I don't know. But it could also be that's not so easy to get to yes compared to, doesn't sound like it would be easy, but there are ways to get to yes on healthcare, immigration, border security, and so forth. So that's the
So
other
it's
thing.
short term versus long term to some degree.
Could be that as well.
Yeah, and we got to talk to all the other groups to figure out what makes sense, because, I mean, money is a big thing.
It's
And
huge.
actually, John is going to head to a conference in, March, January? So Represent Us is another group. And in fact, if you look at your card, the very first thing on the lower right over here is Fight Corruption. We're actually borrowing their Anti-Corruption Act, which is inclusive of campaign finance reform, big money in politics, ranked choice voting, and gerrymandering. All of those are a form of corruption. So because Unite America is so big in terms of what we want to accomplish, we're totally fine. If that's what the group thinks we need to fight here in Wisconsin, we will. But we'll do that together with all of us thinking what's the best way to win this. Okay, great question. Other questions? So my question to you guys, and if we could turn the tables a bit, is, so we're just getting started. Marty just joined in June, we dipped our toe in the water in April, we officially launched in October. What do you think are good ways to begin to get the word out to people? Because we didn't really advertise this, we didn't do any Facebook ad, we just kind of said, just invite friends. We expected about a dozen people, we had about a dozen people. But eventually we'll want to start getting 25, and then 50, and then 200, and then go around all over the state. But, you know, Lena and I are new at this, we don't know how to get people together. You guys have any thoughts on how do we begin to reach out and scale? We'd love ideas.
Well,
One thought is just how do we get to the college students and start at that level?
Okay.
I don't know what that is. It's, you know, having a presence on campus or something.
College students, good. So one of our partner organizations is MAP, Millennial Action Project. So we could talk to them and see, okay, what's the way to partner together with getting the college students? Because they're a process organization like we are too.
What about speaking in front of a number of different groups? I'm thinking about Rotary groups, Kiwanis groups, there are lots of professional women's groups. Libraries all have programs. I mean, it would be exhausting for you guys to do it, but that might be a way just to make people aware.
Okay.
It's a lot more leverage than, I mean, there are a lot of organizations, including one I just watched, they talk about just going like to the street market on Saturday around the Madison Capitol, and you sit at your booth, no, sign my petition. At least if you're speaking to a group, you know, it's sort of captive and they can either come with you or not.
Right.
I was thinking League of Women Voters,
Yeah,
people who have
yeah. I mean,
meetings
there
and are engaged, yeah,
certainly there are plenty of them in
yeah.
southeastern Wisconsin that you could speak to.
I think those ideas are worth considering. So I heard League of Women Voters, Rotary, Kiwanis.
So Pete's in Rotary, and how many members do they have? 250?
We'll have 400 members.
400 members.
You get 200 people.
200 people, okay. So that's good. Yeah, we'd love to chat further about
Tuesday lunch, yeah.
connecting with them.
And they have speakers at the lunches from
Oh,
that?
yeah.
every
Yeah.
week.
In fact, Gus Ramirez, you know his name?
Yes.
Was there,
Austin Ramirez?
Austin.
Okay, I know Austin.
There, about a month ago.
Mhm.
He was very nice.
Yeah, he's
He was on the
CEO.
Catherine Gale,
Mhm.
thing. team.
So he's helping Catherine on Fix the System Wisconsin,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
one of the groups we're partnering
Right.
with.
What did Austin talk about?
Well, he had an independent thing, it was about free trade, he owns a manufacturing company. And it was all the ways in which the current rational policies were affecting people like him.
Mhm.
And, so a lot of it was like that, but then he went off into the money and politics and, I'd say mostly.
Okay.
And was it a responsive audience?
Oh, yes, yeah, it's a very open-minded, group that wants to know things, and there's good Q&A afterwards.
Is it all southeast Wisconsin, Pete? Just Milwaukee, or?
It's downtown, they're more
Downtown,
like
okay.
suburban Rotaries.
Yeah, I'd love to connect with you on that afterwards.
It's downtown where I think they should live.
Yep. Here's the last idea I wanted to bounce off you guys. We were thinking about, what if we had, you know, we love having speakers like Marty and George and the other groups, but also what if we did things like had a night dedicated to a particular topic, so like healthcare or education or the environment, whatever, and then we said, have an expert come in and say, this is what we need to do, this, and this to fix it. But we can't fix it until we change the process of government that would allow these things to pass. Do you think that would be something that would be attractive to people?
You'll bait and switch, huh?
No, not bait and switch, but just tell them that, look, we have, because, you know, like, take gun safety. Marty mentioned gun safety. I think we as Wisconsinites, we have a very good relationship with our guns, and we balance it with sensitivity of being safe. Right? We would, probably most of us, I think, in this room, could craft legislation like your no labels policy book that 60% of Americans could probably agree with. I bet we could, right in this room, come up with common sense legislation.
You could
It would
probably.
never pass.
Yeah, you could probably make a lot of progress with something that seems just by renaming. Gun safety sounds a lot less onerous than gun control.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that would irritate those on the right to say, you're not controlling my guns. But, you know, we're just thinking of ideas.
This is very anecdotal, but it just in talking to our friends about the meeting here and saying, would you like to tell me, they're all so partisan, they're so mad about this election, or not the outcome of it, but they were also fired up to get that election, and I think they think the course of correction is to keep getting more Democrats elected.
To bear down on the current.
And so to bring them out of that into something that is a more generalized solution, less partisan, I mean, the whole state is so partisan, the whole country is so partisan, I think that's a challenge. And it seems to me if you were to go the healthcare route, or you would get people still polarized on that. But wait a minute, that gun safety's not going far enough to the left or to the right, so I'm not sure they'd come to the middle.
Yeah, don't know,
I
we'll
don't know.
try many different ideas. Okay, that's why we're looking for a chief marketing officer to help, how do we start beginning to launch campaigns that can help change people's minds to say, you know, it's not about so much meeting in the middle, but it's about problem solving things together. We may shift more this way or more that way, but if it's something that meets the needs
You
of
know,
everybody.
that just made me think of, or you schedule a debate
Mhm.
between
Ah,
two intelligent
that's an
people who aren't gonna
idea.
crucify each other and say,
That's an idea.
and it made me think of this other
Yeah.
process which I've heard
They
about.
could deteriorate quickly.
It depends.
Okay.
It depends
Well,
on the
we'll have to
moderator and the
moderate
speakers
well, right?
and who you get as an audience. And the other thing I read this, I can't remember the name, but the idea is if you want to solve a problem, you get the people together and you have a facilitated, you say, okay, we appoint a committee, and usually that's a way to kill something. But this committee actually is, you have to come back with a solution, and there's a facilitator who uses a particular technique, and I think they start by getting a common base of facts, and so when you work it through, and then they come up with a proposal, and they come back to the big group and say, here's what we think we should do, and typically they say, oh, yeah, that's pretty good. I don't know what that's called, but that sounds involved.
I know.
That sounds pretty involved though, for but a debate, you know.
But we kind of do this at work.
Like
a lot,
reality
right? I mean, there's
TV.
some different,
Yeah.
I mean, with all the things we see around the world. Anyway, okay.
You know, a problem in social service kinds of not-for-profits is proliferation of small groups trying to do the same thing. They don't have a critical mass. Yeah, and so your strategy could be when you want one of absorption more than one of cooperation. I don't know.
Yeah, we're not trying to absorb it. We're like, look, you can keep your identity, right? But let's be organized in how we approach things together.
Yeah.
Because they're all very common. Because, you know, we're not trying to build empires, and none of the other groups are either. We want to make change. So how do we most effectively make change in the soonest way possible?
But I see your point. I mean, I said I was given a list of 87 names. So I can go to Madison and start Twin Lakes and start signing people up at the Twin Lakes Day, the 4th of July. George Penn has 17,000 names on his mailing list. So, George, you know, do you support this? Could I use your mailing list? And if I've got something that he could use, so at least what we're working on is try to get us together, not just say collaborate, but really have a common roadmap and identify common obstacles that are impeding us and see who's got what resources and are they willing to share or combine.
In the first quarter, we will try to get a live meeting
Yeah,
to do
yeah.
exactly that.
Because I'm not inclined right now to push no labels real hard from where we are in Wisconsin, which is, you know, pretty much me and 10 people. When you got Unite America and United to Amend, and I haven't even seen what Fair Vote has, Carl Nelson and so forth, but if these guys have momentum, let me just
Yep, channel.
yeah, and we'll keep posted if we think, so people have been asking, are we gonna do the unity campaign or that unity commitments in other states? And same answer they gave for Wyler. They said, no, we're gonna focus on New Hampshire because we have limited resources. But if that thing gets legs and a group of us says, boy, this could work in Wisconsin, maybe, I don't know.
Who knows? Okay.
We'll see how it goes.
Honey, you had one last question, then we can wrap.
Yeah, so my thought, and I would like to bounce this off of you, is really what resonates with voters, whether you are on the right or on the left, is just reform with money in politics. That's something that's easy to understand, everybody gets it. So if you have a meeting about, just getting big money out of politics, or a reform, like, we gotta fix the system, fix the broken political system, and these are what we're doing. I feel like we could get both sides engaged, and it's very direct. We're not trying to, talk about policy and then change it to reform, it is about reform, because that really is ultimately the problem. So,
I like the single topic concept. I spent my life being an English teacher,
Okay.
and it's the kid
You
who
are a
comes in
respected profession then, huh?
and, well, it's the kid who says, my paper's on World War II,
Mm.
and you have to sort of focus that
Yeah,
in
narrow that
a
in,
little.
yep.
So, I think, I really do like, because I think what little discretionary time people have, I'd like to be in the macro category and think long range, but I'd rather do something that I can see,
Touch and see
Yeah,
impact.
see
results, you know, so,
Yeah.
you know, it's like, I would like to sit around and write the Federalist Papers and think in like long-term, you know, everybody is working for the good of the country, but right now I have a pot boiling over.
Mm.
You know, how can our company pay for healthcare? We can't. You know, so
That's a good
I'd like to
point.
see that kid with the term paper focus in a little bit more.
Short term is break the gridlock, that is the shortest term that we have, but very good point, Karen. All right. Hey, guys, we're 5 minutes to 8, we'll go ahead and end it here. Listen, let's thank Marty one more time for coming all the way from Twin Lakes. Thank you guys all for coming, and again on a cold one night, appreciate it, and keep in touch, okay? Thanks.
We've seen worse.
Oh, Wisconsin, Mark.
It's pretty warm.